You and I both have been mentioned in newspapers before after interviews, and I can tell you from my own that there are times when they get it wrong.
That's true.
And of course, you went in and used newspapers like no one else has before, which is terrific, and that's one of the bases of this book. So, two questions. One, how reliable can newspapers be because of the fact that they take down notes and then they have to put it down, and there's 2 generations away right there? And also, did you find anything new or extraordinary in researching, especially the newspapers or Lincoln, or did it just basically deepen the knowledge that we already have by making the story broader with more facts and details?
Well, the basic contribution that my book tries to make is to have a more accurate and more detailed study of what Lincoln's life was really like, what he said, what was said about him, what he did, why he did it. And so it's a more, I like to think of it as a 10 megapixel portrait rather than a 3 megapixel portrait. So more detail, more color, more accuracy. But in addition, there are a lot of new data that I uncovered, which I found quite revealing. One of the most controversial aspects of Lincoln's presidency, of course, and pre-presidential years, is Lincoln and race. And almost everybody who writes about Lincoln and race quotes a speech that Frederick Douglass gave in 1876, 11 years after Lincoln's death. And in that speech, Frederick Douglass said that Abraham Lincoln was preeminently the white man's president, and we black folks were only his stepchildren. Well, I discovered in the Frederick Douglass papers at the Library of Congress, in manuscript form, in his own handwriting, 2 speeches by Douglass that tended to contradict this later speech. And one was a speech given in New York on June 1st, 1865 at Cooper Union. And in that speech, Frederick Douglass said, Abraham Lincoln was emphatically the black man's president. I thought, well, wait a minute, emphatically the black man's president? That doesn't square with this 1876, preeminently the white man's president. And in that speech, Douglass goes on to say, this 1865 speech, he says, Abraham Lincoln was the first president to overcome the prejudices of his time and his country. He was the first American president to regard black people as citizens and men and to respect their rights as citizens and men. By inviting me to the White House, he was saying to the country, I am the president of the black people as well as the white people, and I mean to honor their rights as men and as citizens. Well, this was a terrific speech, and so I went to the 5-volume edition of Frederick Douglass's speeches that had been published by the Yale University Press a little earlier, and the speech wasn't there. And so I wrote to the folks at Yale and said, why did you leave this great speech out? No response. So I called them and left a message. No response. Well, those of us who went to Princeton aren't surprised Yale would conduct itself this way. But well, what can I say? So then there was another speech in the Frederick Douglass papers that was omitted from this 5-volume edition that the Yale Press had published. And that was given late in 1865. And in that speech, Frederick Douglass said that Lincoln's last speech, which of course he didn't know was going to be his last speech, on April 11th, 1865, we tended to underestimate, that is, we abolitionists. In that speech, Abraham Lincoln called for the first time publicly for black voting rights. He talked, this was 2 days after Robert E. Lee surrendered, and he addressed the question of Reconstruction. What's going to be done with the 11 defeated Confederate states? How are they going to be readmitted to the Union? What requirements are they going to have to meet? And Lincoln said, apropos of Louisiana, which was going to be the model in his mind for the other 10 Confederate states, he said he believed that the black people there should be allowed to vote, at least those who had served in the Army and those who were very intelligent, by which we assume he meant literate, because there was a large literate free black community in New Orleans. Frederick Douglass said that we abolitionists were somewhat disappointed in this speech because of the limited scope of this voting rights proposal, because it only covered the Union Army veterans and the literate. But we should have recognized that that was an extremely important speech because Abraham Lincoln learned his statesmanship in the school of rail splitting. And to split a rail, you take a wedge and you insert the thin edge of the wedge into the log. And once you've done that, you take a maul, a big hammer, and you drive home the thick edge of the wedge. And we should have known, based on his history, that once Abraham Lincoln decided to put the thin edge of the wedge into the log, you could count on him to drive home the thick edge of the wedge. And that was a very significant speech. And He concluded this speech, Douglas did, in December of 1865 by saying that for all Americans, the death of Abraham Lincoln was a tragedy. But for black people, it was an unspeakable calamity. And those two speeches, I thought, were remarkable commentaries on Lincoln and race, and that they hadn't been previously published as part of Douglas's oeuvre, I thought was something of a scandal. And I've been eager to try to get that information out to folks, and I incorporate a lot of that into the new book.
Exactly. Did your perception, briefly, did your perception of Lincoln change at all through these last 11 years?
Well, yes. Between the time that I wrote The Inner World and the time that I finished this book, my respect for Lincoln deepened as I got to know him better and better. Although his early political career proved to be more disappointing than I had first imagined. That is, in The Inner World of Abraham Lincoln, I emphasize that Lincoln in his 20s and his 30s was something of a hack politician, that he really took the low road, that he was a clever and sarcastic belittler of Democrats. He was a Whig, and he was very adept at ridiculing his opponents. And that wasn't his invention, that was frontier politics, but he was particularly gifted at it. His sarcasm and ridicule were particularly telling, and sometimes his opponents would leave the debate stage blubbering because he had wounded them so deeply. And then I've discovered, while we're working on this new book, I discovered what I considered to be Lincoln's anonymous journalism. And I've identified over 200 pieces by Lincoln that appeared in the Illinois State Register, or a journal, which was the Whig newspaper, then the Republican newspaper, sometimes called the Sangamo Journal. And his law partner, William Herndon, said Lincoln used to write for that paper all the time. And the best man at his wedding, James Matheny, said that when Lincoln was in New Salem, he used to write and send editorials or op-ed pieces down to Springfield, and I would carry them over, said Matheny, to the newspaper office. Well, nobody that I'm aware of has tried to identify those pieces that Lincoln wrote. And as I say, I've identified, but I'm pretty sure are over 200. And these are very low-road political sarcasm and satire, and even race baiting. In 1836 and in 1840, Lincoln, again and again, if I'm correct in this identification, urges people to vote against Martin Van Buren for president because he had supported limited black suffrage at the New York Constitutional Convention in 1821. And that was a standard Whig argument. Lincoln didn't invent that argument, but if I'm right in identifying these items as Lincoln, he really leaned heavily on that argument, both in 1836 when Van Buren was running for president for the first time, and then in 1840 when he was running for re-election. Now, in the collected works of Abraham Lincoln, published back in the 1950s, there is one speech from 1840 in which he alludes to this. But if I'm right, he hammered away at it time and time and time again.
Let me ask you, would you put some of those op-eds in the next collected works as possibilities or probabilities?
I intend to publish a separate volume called Lincoln's Anonymous Journalism, question mark, because you can't prove it beyond peradventure that it was by Lincoln, but I'm pretty sure these are by Lincoln, and I'll spell out in an elaborate introduction why I think they are by Lincoln. And I think it's supremely ironic that Abraham Lincoln, as a young man, said, don't vote for Martin Van Buren because he supported limited black suffrage. And then in 1865, Abraham Lincoln supports limited black suffrage in that speech that I alluded to earlier on April 11th, 1865, and 3 days later he gets murdered for having done that. And we should bear in mind always that Abraham Lincoln was not killed because he supported because he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which, by the way, is here on my tie, along with a little breakfast. Then he was not killed because he supported the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery throughout the country, not just in the Confederate States. Abraham Lincoln was murdered because he called for black voting rights. And we should regard Lincoln, therefore, as a martyr to black civil rights as much as Martin Luther King or Medgar Evers or James Reeb or Viola Liuzzo or Michael Schwerner or Andrew Goodman or James Chaney or any of those people who were killed in the 1960s championing the Civil Rights Revolution.
Well, you say being a politician early on, and let me jump to the debates. I was going to ask this later, but since you brought this up. Lamon, in the margin of the book by Holland, Holland says that he was truthful, a truthful man. And in the margin, Lamon says that he could put his truth aside when necessary. And there he went, and he was talked about by others as speaking differently up here in the north than he did in the south of Illinois during the debates. Is that putting the truth aside?
Well, it's a question of emphasis rather than truth, I think. Stephen A. Douglas, during the 1858 campaign, criticized Lincoln for talking one way in northern Illinois and another way in southern Illinois. And Lincoln denied it. But in fact, there is some truth in that. Lincoln gives, at the beginning of the 1858 campaign, he comes to Chicago and gives a speech in July of 1858 in which he takes a pretty radical stance. He says, all this business that the Democrats talk about this race being superior to that race and all that, let's just forget all this quibbling about which race is superior and which race is inferior, and let's all unite and agree that we endorse the principles of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And then the Democrats hammer him on that. They keep quoting that along with the House divided speech, in which Lincoln says that the nation cannot long survive half slave and half free, as too radical. And so when Lincoln goes to the southern part of the state, when he goes to Jonesboro and places like that, he de-emphasizes those arguments and attacks Stephen A. Douglas more on constitutional grounds and the like. But Douglas won't let go. He keeps emphasizing that Lincoln favors black equality. And that was the essence of Douglas's argument and Democratic arguments against Republicans in this period, that the Republican Party favored black civil rights, black voting rights, black rights to serve on jurors, to hold office, to intermarry with whites. And Lincoln says in one of the debates at Charleston in 1858, that's a false issue. Republicans do not believe, I do not believe, that blacks should be voters or jurors or allowed to intermarry with whites or the like. But that's a false issue. The real issue before us is slavery. Is slavery right or is slavery wrong? If you believe slavery is right and it should be allowed to expand, vote Democratic, because that's what Douglas stands for. If you believe slavery is wrong and shouldn't be allowed to expand, vote Republican. But let's not muddy the waters with this false issue of black citizenship rights.
A number of emails have already come in, and I'm going to ask you one briefly before we take a quick break. Can you share any insight as to how Lincoln and Secretary of State Seward worked together to prevent foreign intervention during the Civil War? Thank you, Mary. Appreciate that.
Well, one of the most striking features of Lincoln's character was his magnanimity, his ability to overlook insults, to overlook patronizing criticism. And one of the things that Seward felt he was much more qualified to be president than Lincoln was. And that he was the head of the Republican Party for a long time, that he was the intellectual head of the Republican Party. And when a German American was aspiring to be appointed to a first-class ambassadorship in Europe, Seward was opposed to it. And one of the German American's friends went in and said, if you don't name Karl Schurz as an ambassador to a first-class mission in Europe, you're going to alienate and disappoint all the German American voters who are the critical voting bloc. And Seward bangs his fist on the table and says, disappointed? How dare you talk to me about disappointed? I, who was the intellectual founder of the Republican Party, I was the governor of New York, I was a senator from New York, have been passed over for this little hick lawyer from Illinois. Don't you dare talk to me about disappointment. And then Seward writes on April 1st to Lincoln saying, in effect, you haven't really adopted any policy, foreign or domestic, and if you're not willing to do it, I think you should allow some member of the cabinet to do it. Hint, hint. And Lincoln, instead of taking umbrage at this, gently but firmly puts Seward in his place, and then Seward becomes a very close friend of Lincoln's. They work hand in glove together. And one of the ways in which foreign intervention was prevented was that Seward exercised skillful diplomacy, and every now and then he would be not so skillful and would be a little intemperate, and Lincoln would calm him down and modify his dispatches so that he wouldn't be too belligerent. But it's one of the more remarkable stories of the Civil War is how Lincoln and Seward cooperated, not just on foreign affairs, but on policy matters in general. And it's a tribute both to Lincoln that he would overlook Seward's rather patronizing attitude toward him, and it's a tribute to Seward that he recognized right away that Lincoln was the boss. And he writes to his wife in June of 61 saying, "Executive skill and ability are rare qualities, and Lincoln is the best of us all."